On today's episode of Newscast, we're having a big chat about prisons, and that's for two reasons. One, today's big news story is that in England and Wales, the early release scheme has kicked in. Because the prison estate is so overcrowded, the new government has decided that some people can be released earlier in their sentences than they would otherwise have been. And so today, about 1,700 people have been released early from prisons in England and Wales. The second big prison story today is that His Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons, Charlie Taylor, has published his annual report, which collects together all the inspections he's done in more than 70 institutions over the last year. So we had a chat with Charlie. You can hear the whole thing on today's episode of Newscast, the podcast. But here is a little selection of some of our conversation, which was really interesting, but also does include some references to people taking their own lives in prison.
Newscast from the BBC.
Right, so your report, it is, as somebody who, I've been to a prison once when I was working on Newsround years and years and years ago, but to me it's something that I just see on the news. I don't go to prisons. It is so eye-opening, and it seems to me that each type of institution that you went to has got a different problem. In men's prisons, it seems to be that there's nothing for them to do. Like, you're just locked in your cell the whole time.
Yeah, that's right. It's deeply depressing. We go to many reception prisons, the sort of the Wormer Scrubs, the Pentonvilles, the Birmingham jails, these old Victorian prisons where they're completely overpopulated, where you've often got two guys sharing a cell that's originally designed for one person, and people are often banged up for 22 hours a day. But even in Category C training prisons, which have got facilities where prisoners ought to be learning the skills, going into education, getting the training they need in order that they can get employment when they come out. We go to many of those places and we walk into empty classrooms, and still we find prisoners locked on the wings with nothing to do. And that is an enormous frustration for us. Out of 32 men's prisons, closed prisons that we inspected last year, 30 of them were either inadequate or not sufficiently good for education provision. That just isn't good enough.
And it seems to me that in some of the places, the education provision is there. It's just that the prison's not been able to get their act together in a way to let their inmates use it.
Yeah, I walked into a classroom in one jail. There was a teacher in there trying to teach a maths class. There were 3 prisoners in there. I said, how many do you normally have? She said, I'm supposed to have 10. Sometimes I have 10. Sometimes I have 3. Sometimes I have 1. Sometimes I have nobody. I never know who's going to turn up. Well, maths is a linear subject. You need to be there every day of the week in order to be able to keep up. And the danger, of course, then is that if you don't know who's going to turn up, the job becomes more and more frustrating. And you may be shiny-eyed and enthusiastic as a teacher going in, but after a bit, you just get worn down by a system that doesn't appear to value what you do.
Drugs, which seems like a massive problem. Are we talking about like cannabis or spice or even harder stuff?
There is now in most prisons a menu from which you can choose. So whatever is your drug of fancy, provided you're able to afford it or you're prepared to get into debt, that drug is available. So it used to be that spice was the main drug that was getting into prisons because it's very easy to get in lots of different forms. You can soak paper in it. We even came across a pair of underpants that had been soaked in spice and were then going to be chopped up and put into joints and smoked by prisoners. So spice used to be the kind of drug of choice. Of course, it's very risky because you get different batches have completely different effects. So one might just make everybody soporific. The other one might make people aggressive. Another one might make people ill. But now, particularly because of drone incursions and because of the big payloads that some of the drones are able to bring into prisons, actually we're seeing a broader range of prisons. So I walked around, when I walked around Wandsworth, when we started the inspection there, the smell of cannabis was ubiquitous across the jail. And that's not unusual, unfortunately. When I first started in the role, it was very rare to smell things like cannabis. Now it's not at all uncommon. So prisons are being hit very hard by sophisticated organised crime who have huge markups. They can afford to lose lots of these packages because they're making enough money on the stuff that does get in.
Thing is, I remember when drones first became a big thing, it was about 3 years ago, And I remember lots of government initiatives and ministers saying we're going to clamp down on this. So, but that's still happening.
It's still happening a lot, yeah. And in some prisons, they're getting hit very hard by big, heavy drones with big payloads who are able to destabilise a prison, for up to a week just with one load. And of course, what's also coming in is mobile phones as well. And that means there's a potential threat to victims, but also there's a way of them being able to direct organised crime type activities within prison.
This might sound a bit sort of insubstantial to people, but if you read Rory Stewart's book about his time as a prisons minister, you'll know that cleanliness and just how clean the place is very, very important. Tell me the story about the blood stain. So there's a picture of a blood stain in your report.
Yeah, I mean, it's deeply depressing. This is Whitemoor Prison, which is a new prison, only built earlier on this century. It ought to be a very easy place to keep clean. It has very high levels of staff because it's a Category A prison, and lots of prisoners there with not enough to do. We arrive on day one. There's a pool of blood. I don't know where it came from, and I dread to think where it came from. But as the inspection week went on, that pool of blood just stayed there, and nobody cleared it up. And it finally got dealt with on the last day of the inspection. But it's that kind of thing that we see in prisons. And if you're unable to keep the prison even clean, that says a lot about the prison. Because actually, in our report, we talk about places like Swansea Prison, which is a real crumbling old Victorian prison. But you could eat your lunch off the floor there because they make an absolute point of keeping it clean. Similarly with places like Preston, places like Cardiff as well. So it can be done even in those worst sorts of prisons. So there is something about just a real deterioration in terms of the care that's going on when you come across a jail that's just filthy like that.
And is that just down to the leadership of the individual prisons? Like in some places, the boss of the prison's really good and cleanliness is a priority, and in other places they're just not.
Well, certainly, when we go to prisons where everybody knows who the governor is, where the governor walks around the place and you go to somewhere like Birmingham Prison, where the previous governor, Paul Newton, was there. Everybody knew him. He would appear as if by magic out of the blue at different times during the day. He was very hot on standards of cleanliness around the jail, and the jail looked good. Another crumbling Victorian jail that was able to maintain decent standards because of that. So it is about setting really high expectations of the prisoner, but also high expectations of the staff there. But the other difficulty you often get is that staff are very inexperienced who are working in prisons. So often they don't even know what the standard they should be aiming for is. You've got inexperienced staff sometimes being mentored and supervised by staff who are barely more experienced than they are themselves.
Right, I'm now going to read out two bits from your report that were actually just the most shocking things. I mean, all the things we discussed were quite shocking, but the two things that really stood out for me as incredibly shocking are right at the start in the summary, you talk about Bristol Prison and the report you did there, which was published in July last year. And you said, there had been 8 self-inflicted deaths at Bristol since our last inspection, and 1 prisoner had been charged with murdering his cellmate. So basically 8 prisoners had taken their own life in quite a short space of time.
Yeah, and there had actually been 5 deaths in the year before we went to the prison. And these are deaths of despair. This is where you get prisoners who are not being cared for properly. Very often it's remand prisoners who are at most risk of taking their own lives. Sometimes they're coming into prison for the first time. They've lost contact with family and friends.
Oh, so people who are waiting for their trial. Yeah.
Indeed, people who are disconnected from families. They haven't been in prison before. They're very anxious about what they may find. They're detoxing from things like alcohol and drugs. And look, we know that occasionally, very tragically, suicides can happen in any prison. But where you see a cluster of suicides, like we found in Bristol, like we've seen in Leeds, like we've seen before our recent inspection in Wandsworth, it's very often a symptom that something is going badly wrong in the jail. If prisoners are locked up in their cells all day, if they're not being engaged in any purposeful activity, if they're not getting access to any fresh air, and they're not getting the support that they need, then the danger is they just reach a state of complete despair, and sadly they take their own life. And each one of those deaths isn't just about that prisoner, it's about that prisoner's family, about that prisoner's children, about that prisoner's parents, but also spare a thought for the staff who have to deal with the aftermath of someone who's taken their own life as well in prisoners too.
Well, yeah, what happens in a prison if somebody has taken their own life?
Well,
or is it just treated as sadly a fact of life and everyone just gets on with it?
Well, no, it has an enormously traumatizing effect on staff work. I mean, on other prisoners, but on staff working there as well. It isn't just a fact of life. It's a really awful thing that happened. Governors say they will wear every suicide they've ever had for the rest of their career that has happened on their watch. So it causes enormous upset for prisons because they know the effect they have on staff and they know the effect that it has on prisoners' families.